Hello, welcome to this webinar. I see that you are starting to arrive. I will just wait a couple of seconds before I start, as you are still coming into this webinar. So I'm Guillemette Carlucci. I'm the Executive Education Portfolio Manager, as well as the Learning Manager for our programs on advocacy in international affairs. And before we start the webinar, I would like to explain a few logistical points. You can type your questions. You will see that you will have some time at the end of this webinar for questions and discussions. Please use the Q&A, question and answer box, not the chat, because otherwise we won't be able to manage your questions. So please use the Q&A function only. You will receive, after this webinar, the PowerPoint presentation, and the presentation will last for approximately 30 minutes, and then you will have time for questions. And without further ado, I will leave the floor to Davide and Christophe. Davide, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. My name is Davide Rodogno. I'm the director of this certificate, and with me, Christophe Lécureuil, who is also part of our team and is our lead specialist on advocacy. Tonight, we're going to talk about philanthropic foundations, advocacy, and the issue of fundraising. So it's a multiple transnational actors and a very delicate matter that we're going to deal with tonight. This is the agenda that Guillemette has already mentioned, 30 minutes presentation, and we are going to open the floor for questions and answers. The purpose of our meeting is very, very simple. We would like to contextualize the purpose of advocacy for philanthropic foundations, which is a very specific topic, but we think it has an awful lot of potential, and it's going to be connected to a number of things that, of course, we are going to deal with in our certificate, and we're going to connect it to fundraising strategies. We will start defining advocacy and advocacy for philanthropic foundations more specifically, and we will examine the issue of fundraising in central part of the presentation. And this is the part that Christophe will deal with in a second. And I will conclude before opening the floor to your questions. Now, allow me to start with a few things on advocacy. And there is a very little tip that we remind to all our participants systematically. Different people have very different ideas about advocacy. So there is not a single universal definition of advocacy that is going to fit all purposes. And maybe what you think might be very, very different according from where you come from what your interlocutor might think. And this also applies to actors like philanthropic foundations. And this is something that we're going to deal with in a few minutes. So by advocacy, we define the act or the process of defending or promoting an idea, person, a cause, a movement, a legislation, a product, or a project. Advocacy aims at influencing specific audiences, and the question of audiences is really important. It could be the general public, it could be peers, it could be influencers, if you use this social media, digital media kind of language, which is very important today. It could be for decision makers, for policy makers, for donors, and the audiences might be within political, institutional, economic, or social systems. Advocacy can be carried out by very diverse actors. It could be individuals, you and I, groups of individuals, public institutions, intergovernmental organizations, NGOs, companies, trade associations, and of course, philanthropic foundations. Advocacy uses the tools and techniques available to influence perceptions, beliefs, and behaviors, and this is done in very different way. Advocacy is generally multidimensional, and this is why it is difficult to study it. It is multi-channel, and it is multi-jurisdictional, and this is a point that we're going to cover in our conclusion. So it could be local, regional, national, international, and several of these things at the same time. Now, what kind of actors are philanthropic foundations? Where should we place them if we were to imagine an environment or a landscape? And what could we say about the advocacy strategies of philanthropic foundations? And in this slide here, you can see 4 different silos. NGOs and what they generally do, so to raise awareness, to influence legislation, to access funding, to put some pressure, to do some enforcement in terms of changing of legislations, for instance, some behavioral change, program delivery. And you can see that some of these things are also done by governments and by intergovernmental organizations. Behavioral change, agenda setting, negotiation, legislations, and enforcement. Now, when you look at the private sector too, in so many ways, does things that the other actors do. Brand reputation, customer retention, employee engagement, influence legislation, behavioral change, access to new markets. Philanthropic foundations do more or less the same thing in their own ways. This is something that we should bear in mind. But at the same time, they also act as donors, and they might be those that allow NGOs to reach their objectives. The philanthropic foundation, at the same time, can advocate for access funding. They can put pressure to change the legislation or to induce a behavioral change. And of course, for those of you that come from a context which is the Swiss context, you also have les sociétés d'utilité publique, or public interest societies or companies, which are part of this landscape. And I'll go back to this point later on. What they do very often, this applies to philanthropic foundations, or at least some of them, and some other actors, they do campaign. And these campaigns can follow a very scientific method or a political method. And that, as you can see in the cartoon here, one goes about it, the scientific method. Here are the facts. What conclusions can we draw from them? And the political method is exactly the opposite. Here's the conclusion. What facts can we find to support it? And as we are going to see, fundraising is related to these 2 different methods that are, of course, in tension between them. And this is something that we can discuss later on. In this other slide, we can see a few things. Now, if you read the slide horizontally, you will have public sector and public campaigning. This is what the public sector does, or who the public sector is, rather, the governments, intergovernmental organizations, other public institutions, NGOs, agencies, parties, and this is their purpose. And we've discussed about that. Now, if you take the horizontal part of the slide that is below the public sector, you have the private sector and the lobbying and public affairs. This is who they are: companies, associations, federations, individuals, and this is what they do: lobbying and public affairs, changing or keeping a given legislation, accessing or protecting resources and funds, improving or changing infrastructure. Now, what we're seeing in the last 20 years or so is exactly this processing. The private sector doing public campaigns, the public sector doing public affairs. And this is absolutely interwoven. And of course, back to our question, where do we place philanthropic foundations? And when does fundraising take place? At what moment, for what reasons? And this is something that we are going to discuss in a moment. So far, I've been presenting the stakeholders, those creatures, so to say, that populate this landscape that we're going to discuss. And now entering into the core of our presentation, these are the donors. And here there is a list. Donors can be governments or development agencies, and many of them are directly related to governments, not systematically, not always, but this might be the case. They can be international, they can be multilateral. Foundations themselves do these fundings, and they can be donors, of course. The business community and foundations, that we're going to discuss some cases later on. High net worth individuals, which is a very interesting case. Large NGOs, and of course, this list can continue. And I will turn the floor immediately to Christophe.
Thank you, Davide. So the purpose of this session is obviously not to tell you which fundraising tactic is the best, because it clearly depends on a number of things, on your structure, on your membership, on your opportunistic ability to go and search for funds, to scan them, and to identify them, to go for them. So it really depends. But here's a list, of course, not exhaustive. And it really depends on pretty much on the way that you're structured somehow. But you could have fundraising events. Think of an NGO whose membership are the medical professionals. So, you organize conferences, we used to, hopefully it will come back, around the world, and people would travel. Sometimes 20,000 people would turn up to these to these conferences. So that's how some of them get the fundraising. It can be simply membership fees, whether it's individuals, whether it's national associations of an international NGO, for example. It could be grants, going for grants directly for your organization or for the various projects that you may have on the ground. Interestingly, you mentioned high net worth individuals, where there's also advisory boards that come into play. I can think of a very large NGO that has a very powerful advisory boards made up of kings and very wealthy CEOs, for example. And then, of course, there are the direct individual donations, in particular for the emergencies NGOs like the MSF of this world, where also they have a policy of not going for institutional donations. To complicate the whole thing is that you're not on your own. And here is random logos that we've put up, ranging from private sector to NGOs to international organizations, and everybody's going for money, including international organizations with member states, right? So, and this pot of money may be increasing in some policy areas, but may be stable or decreasing in other policy areas. So the cake is probably not getting bigger and bigger every year, year on. So you are more people trying to go for the same amount of money. Which brings me to my first point or a piece of advice is you don't operate in a vacuum, so anchor or frame your ask. So it can be anything ranging from the Sustainable Development Goals to World Health issue or the EU Green Deal, if that's the way you want to get money from. But anchor your ask is critical because, especially for the institutional donors, it's really critical for them that it fits in the picture somewhere. So you have to make sure that you understand the policy mechanics behind that and priorities. The second piece that I wanted to bring related to this is, so once you frame your thinking on how you're going to approach that fundraising strategy, you have to put a narrative together. So I would encourage you not to be solely project specific and technical, because in the end, the approval system will be at a higher level than simply a technical person. So build a narrative, right? Which makes sense. And this is a tool that we use in the advocacy course, which is very useful. I think, frankly, it can describe a person, an organization, a project, whatever you want. But it gives you some flexibility. If you see that, your theme around policy X and supporting, therefore, a project according to that policy is not flying very well, back yourself up with a couple of other themes where you say, okay, maybe that would be more interesting for this potential donor. The other piece which I thought I'd bring up is that many donors, increasingly, and I've seen that since the last 10 years when I was working in the NGO community, now it's really coming to pretty much every large donor, especially government foundations, is they will ask you, what is your impact? Why should I fund your project or your organization? Show me the results. And they are much more stringent about it. And some of them have introduced what they call the logic model or theory of change, which has been coined by Oxfam a lot. And they use this type of template, working backwards from where do you want to go, your desired outcome, to how do you make that happen? How do you make that happen? How do you make that happen? And they want you to put together a whole framework around this logic model or theory of change. So study this, because that will be very important. And I'll come back to this. It will be important for the reporting as well. So this is how it looks like as an example that I won't detail, but if you were an NGO or a government willing to fund initiatives to reduce consumption of particular products, for example, containing salt, fat, or sugar, then you could put something together that looks like this in terms of reducing availability, increased pricing, behavioral change, and you may, maybe you won't have the whole funding for the whole three types of approaches, but maybe behavioral change, is that something that could interest one or more donors? And you can go with different bits and pieces if you design the logic model, which is thorough like this. So there are various adaptations, right, ranging from what I mentioned, Oxfam. The EU, for example, is more a project management type of approach, which is a log frame, which is quite extensive in terms of reporting. The US government is doing also this type of approach. So there are lots of things that you can have a look at. And another point, which is, you probably know this Mountain Dew or you don't, where it's actually the same as the next one, but completely different from where you sit. On the left-hand side, it is the Matterhorn or the Cervin, seen from the Italian side. And on the right-hand side, it is seen from the Swiss side, which means your interlocutors will have a different perspective. So put yourself in their shoes when you engage with them. So I said I'd come back quickly on the measurement, because that's critical to ensure that you justify the money that you got, but also hopefully to get more money for your future projects. And this is real. I mean, what you see in inverted commas in bold, I found real life international Geneva language. And my point is, you have to be very precise in defining your outcome, because it will help you demonstrate the measurement and your success. So empowering women in Africa is a great vision, but probably not good to go and fundraise. Enabling 50% of adult women in West Africa to own and operate smallholder farms over the next 10 years is probably a better approach, right? Creating a paradigm shift in the development space, I tell you, this is true language that I've seen, it is probably not going to get you there. So, but increasing annual investment from the financial sector, as an example, towards smaller island nations by X% over the next few years is going to be better. And then you can read the final example for yourselves. So measurement, I mean, it's a complex thing. Let's try and make it simple. Key performance indicators, what are you measuring? Output measures, how much of it? And then the important piece, outcome measures, what did we change? So to conclude, I would say a couple of things before I conclude. One is we use a 5-step approach when we develop advocacy campaigns, ranging from defining the challenge and the outcome, as I mentioned, looking at the context, stakeholders, your communication strategy, your messaging, of course, timelines, tactics, tools, budget, evaluation. I would argue that you have to use exactly the same approach when you put together a fundraising strategy. These are the same elements, and probably some of the same stakeholders. And you have to look hard at the way they're structured. I won't mention names, but remembering some of the people that I've worked in, the organizations that I've worked with, it was very siloed. So fundraising was doing fundraising and not talking to advocacy or not talking to communications. And it didn't make sense, because it's an organizational strategy. And sometimes you need the backup of your legal team. And sometimes you need an external relations to help you out. But if you go on your own, you pretty much diminish the chances of getting to where you want as a fundraiser. So to me, fundraising is about this, really. You get lots of data, and you know the thing. You are the experts. You know what has to change to have a good intervention in country X. But you have to make a sense of it for the people who would fund your project, and come down to a story. You're going to tell a story. So at least that's the perspective that I have on this. And before passing on to Davide again, let me put that seed in your mind as well. Some of the donors are actually advocates themselves. I mean, this is from the World Health Organization. I haven't seen that they've updated that chart. I was looking at it yesterday. But what you see is that, and I'm not putting any judgment on this, but some of the big donors are foundations that you will cover again in a minute, or large NGOs like Gavi. So they also have, their own life, if you will, as advocates. So it's quite interesting to be aware of that when you go and fundraise towards those NGOs, large philanthropic organizations. Bear in mind they are also advocates and influencers. Davide, back to you.
Thank you very much. And we go back to one of the points that we would like you to take away from our presentation tonight, which is precisely you really have to know the creature, the beasts that you are studying, whether you are in a position because you are doing your fundraising campaign or because you are an advocate. And this particular creature here, philanthropic foundations, first of all, they've been around for quite some time. In so many cases, there are plenty of analogies. In some cases, they do advocacy campaigns. There is an awful lot to say about the ways in which they are funded, but also the way in which they act as donors. And the example of the WHO with the Bill and Melinda Gates is just perfect because if your graph is correct, they were the second largest donor for the WHO, and this has a meaningful impact in so many ways on the kind of things that the WHO can do or cannot do. But historically speaking, you have yet another philanthropic foundations, the Rockefeller Foundation, who did exactly the same thing at the times of the League of Nations during the interwar period, in which the Rockefeller Foundation was by far the largest donor of the League of Nations Health Organization, which was the predecessor of the WHO. So I really would like to draw your attention on some of these creatures and potential donors that are around, that have been there for quite some time. And something else that I would like to draw your attention to is that contrary to the first half of the 20th century, in the 21st century, the landscape of very large donors is very, very different. Contrary to what some of you might think, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is not the larger, the most endowed philanthropic foundation around the world. The Novo Nordisk Foundation from Denmark is. And as you can see in this charter here, it's by far bigger than the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, at least on paper. And of course, you see also non-Western actors. You have the Azimi Premier Foundation from India, located in Bangalore, which is a very large one. And of course, what you do not see here are plenty of Emirati, Qatari, or other philanthropic foundations that are equally extremely large, extremely wealthy, and have activities well beyond the area of the Middle East. So this is something that we would like you to bear in mind. And then going from the very, very global scale to the very local scale, well, I was referring to, and I know that some of you come from Switzerland, whether you are from Swiss Germany or Swiss Romande parts of the country, you will see that there is yet another actor like the Société d'utilité publique, and in this particular case, the Société Genevoise d'utilité publique. Well, these are actors that do advocacy, that have plenty of specificities and limitations, even legal limitation when it comes to fundraising. And this is something that if you are used to this Swiss context, these are actors that you have to deal with in a number of ways. For the Swiss among us, whether you are a kid or not, you have been exposed to some of them, for instance, the Pro Juventute, and some of them have been around for quite some time. So this is something that we invite you to be aware of. We were telling you that the local context might be very different, that the actors might be very different, and this is just an example. And if you are French, and so we are talking about a neighboring country of Switzerland, well, any French person will tell you that, well, things are very different in France from Switzerland. And so, for instance, the Association Loi 1901 is what defines a public service, une société d'utilité publique in that particular in that particular case. And we are bringing up this example here simply because when it comes to fundraising, there might be differences. And also the fiscal, legal, political conditions are very different. And then there is something else that should be said, and I will take the example of Switzerland, but in this particular case, this is something that goes beyond Switzerland. Many philanthropic foundations have a specific kind of, many large companies have a specific foundation. So for instance, Japan Tobacco has its own foundation, Syngenta has its own foundation. And so, of course, there are plenty of questions that we can ask ourselves when it comes to fundraising and when it comes to the advocacy campaigns that are set up by these particular actors. Here you have a very clear example of the language and the kind of things that some of them do. This refers to Syngenta and their agri-services, risk management and financial inclusions, access to seeds, research and development. You might get the impression that this is just like any other NGOs trying to solve an environmental problem, etc., etc. The thing is that this is the foundation that is related in a number of ways with a company, with a multinational company, Syngenta. They are certainly not an exception, because if you think about Switzerland, many large companies have their own foundation. This might be the case of Nestlé or other pharma business companies of this particular country. And this is also a feature of this particular sector in many other cases around the world. This is more of the same. And so before concluding, this is just a way of thinking about what kind of fundraising, who raises funds, who are the sponsor and why, and who are the actors. And here you have just 4 cas de figure, some examples. You can have a donor that happens to be local, the recipient is local, and the action or the advocacy will be local. You have cases in which the donor is local, the recipient is local, but the action takes place abroad. A third example, the donor is foreign, the recipient is foreign, but the action might be very local. And the fourth case in which the donor is foreign, the recipient is foreign, and the action also take place in a third country. And there are plenty of examples. So we go back to the question of contextualizing, knowing the stakeholders, knowing the legal political context. And these are all aspects that we cover in our course. So we would like to thank you for joining us. We are going to open the floor for questions and answers. And in the PowerPoint that we're going to share with you, we will give you more details on our executive programs, the dates, the applications, the questions, the go-to person, and we would like to let you know that there will be another webinar on the 8th of March that is going to cover the program and the contents of the program that will start on the 23rd of March 2022. Thank you.
So I would like just to remind everyone, please type your questions in the question and answer box and not the chat. So we already have a couple of questions. First, a question from Sasha. Sasha is asking, how does advocacy change when you go with a donor who already is in the topic versus a donor who is completely new to the topic? Does that change anything to the...
Yes, obviously, it's much harder work to go towards a potential donor who doesn't know at all about the topic that you are working on, because then you have to put the context into their brain to sell it somehow to them that it's a critical interventional project that they need to look at. So if a philanthropic organization has dedicated itself to the environment, like you mentioned, Syngenta, if you want to link your health project to this, you have to somehow make the links. And a lot of NGOs are now increasingly trying to make links. And that's why in this profession, you really have to connect dots. I think it's a really nice skill that you should have, because if you focus only on what you do, it's going to be difficult. You're going to exclude a lot of potential donors. But if you're smart at linking their issues towards your issues, then it's easier. So that would be my answer. If a potential donor is completely outside the scope of what you do, study exactly the potential relationship and connections that your projects or organization can have for them.
Yeah, there is a point that you mentioned to add something else that speaks to me today, and specifically in the world we live in today. There are also a number of transversal issues. So I don't know if you are interested in two things, two examples: education or sustainability. Here you can be creative and brave enough to reach out to donors that might seem at first glance to be very far away from the interests of your campaigns and the objectives of your campaign. But it might be worth giving it a try, especially if you are thinking about some philanthropic foundations, because some of the interests of the philanthropic foundations are extremely largely defined. And so there might be a way of, to interest them in your cause, in your campaign, and what you want to achieve.
Look at the question of COVID over the past 2 years. At the beginning, everybody was in crisis mode, and then you saw after the months, organizations wanted to continue communicating about what they were doing in a particular area. I'm thinking, for example, of non-communicable diseases and so on. And then suddenly, some of these organizations decided to hook themselves to piggyback on COVID and saying, well, we are an important part of the solution. So there are always ways like that to connect.
A question from Shreya. Since measuring public awareness or behavioral change in numbers is extremely hard, what are some of the other ways we can record such impact through a logistical logic framework?
It's a tough question. Measurement is really the most difficult thing. I remember when I was working for an NGO 10 years ago, our main donor was actually the Gates Foundation. And we were shocked when originally they were asking really simple stuff in terms of pretty much outputs, and I was in the communications department. So how many people have we reached and so on. That was easy. And then that's when they introduced that question of the logic model into the requirements, including for the communications people and the advocacy people. So we had that's where it forced us to be much more integrated with our overall team, so that we were fully working with the project people and so on. So this we could develop something around an intervention. The problem is, and that was nutrition. How do you demonstrate a health impact in a year on nutrition? And that's where we were struggling. So it's not so much around the advocacy, which is relatively easy to demonstrate that you can measure people's behaviors or what they think. But measuring the actual impact of a health intervention, for example, takes a lot of time. So for me, that's a struggle. That's where you have to work really hard with the project people and your experts to see, okay, what can we deliver?
I think also the question is a wonderful one. So thank you very much. During the course, we also take a very critical stance with respect to measurement, because first of all, there are things that, as you just said, we cannot measure, and certainly the measurement is very ephemeral. It's going to last and you might get it very wrong. So it's a cautionary tale and a way of being extremely modest, but also a way to interact with donors, telling them, look, the way you want to measure this is not correct. It might make sense for you, but these are the limitations. So a reflection, and probably critical reflections of what we measure, why we measure, how we measure, and how far we can go, and the things that we cannot do are also part of a transparent way of acknowledging the limits of the exercise. And this, to me, is extremely important. Also in the relation, especially if you, and by you, I mean an international organization or a small NGO, you wish to have a long-lasting relationship with a given donor.
And exactly to that point of engaging in a long relationship with donors, we have a question from Shani. What is your recommendation for engaging donors on advocacy when the investment has to be long-term, 10 years and not just annual achievements?
Is the question related about the fact it's easier to do short-term or long-term?
That's a good question.
Well, I think that's where you have to work in a piece, not negatively talking about a piecemeal approach, but something which is sizable. So you have kind of big objectives which may require a 5-year advocacy plan, right? And of course, you want to report back or have achievements along the way. So some of the literature around measurement talks about interim outcomes, for example. So that's between outputs and outcomes, because think about changing a piece of legislation in Brussels. It can take years. So you're not going to achieve that if you're supported financially to do this. But you can show that along the way, your issue is on the agenda, that political parties have decided to support your stance. So you can measure those interim outcomes. So that's a good way of explaining that you are making progress towards your final outcome. That would be my approach.
Thank you. And we have a question from Martin. Is there indeed an international database for donors that you could recommend?
Difficult. I mean, you have to go piece by piece, like the WHO website, like the foundation. I mean, there are probably paying. I guess you have to pay to obtain some of the database. I'm always weary about buying databases because it's pretty much anybody putting that together and providing names that are outdated. Like, have you ever bought a media list, for example? Well, it's outdated after 6 months. So I think there's value in doing the research yourself, because that's where you suck into the policy areas that they're interested in, and you tailor your messaging and go and speak to them. So it's a bit of a hit and miss, but it's better than sending a random letter because you've seen an email address as part of a database of 1,000 pages.
Just to add, to me, it's really about doing your homework. So if you need it for some reasons, also to double check, it might be worth investing and buying some of this database, but nothing will ever replace doing your homework, because this will then give you the perimeter of your action, whether this is digital or physical, but this is the way forward, I think.
And this is wonderful, because a few of you, Suzanne and Eduardo, have shared in the chat some names or links to such platforms.
We can extract them and send them to participants. Yeah.
We have a question from Merveille. I want to know if the second module is taking place only in Geneva. I have to travel. Do I have to travel, or can I participate online? Well, this is a very good question. The second module indeed is taking place in Geneva. The reason being that you are working in groups on an actual advocacy campaign, because we want you not only to have the analytical skills, but also to try and do an advocacy campaign. So go through the real process of what it is. However, of course, in adjusting to the current situation, we will be pleased to welcome those participants who cannot travel due to the situation. So indeed, there is a possibility to participate online.
It's in your interest, though, if you consider taking this certificate, to try and make an effort to come here, because from experience, and we've been running this certificate for many years now, 11 years, we know that in terms of networking, of connecting, etc., it's much easier. And I would like to be very honest and tell you that you will miss something if you cannot make it, because those who are here can clearly network more, connect more, and probably even the human experience is different if you can join us in person. So if possible, I would suggest and I would recommend you to join us in person for the second module.
Question from Marina. How do you handle differences in strategy between the donor and the NGO asking for support? Same goal, but different strategy.
I would not do it because that's a recipe for disaster, frankly. I mean, I'm not talking about the overall organizational strategy, right? I'm talking about why you got money from the donor. And if you disagree on the strategy, it's probably not going to work.
Nothing else to add.
A question from Sasha about the European Union as a donor. Isn't the funding from Horizon 2020 or Platina 3 a type of fundraising a company or association or startup might look for?
And I'm not anymore. I used to live in Brussels for 10 years, so I'm not in tune anymore exactly with each or every program. What I can tell you is a few things. Yes, I mean I think it's the world's largest donor, the EU, in the end. So there are zillions of programs to fund anything, right? A couple of comments. It takes a lot of time. I mean, the process to put the proposals together, get the money is long. The reporting is a nightmare. So, once you engage with the EU, you need a serious team to be working on that. So, the money is there, but getting it is not that easy as we think, and getting it again and again and again takes a lot of efforts.
Someone is asking about if they are not coming from France or Switzerland, can they have examples of other countries?
Of course, by the way, since we cannot be specialists of every country in the world, what we do in the program is precisely to have 2 full days devoted to advocacy around the world. And of course, the question of fundraising pops up quite often. And we do have specialists from Africa, from Asia, from the Middle East, from North and South America that either doing module 1, and there are really 1 day and a half, almost two full days devoted to that, or during module 2, precisely to cover these aspects. And precisely this is a way for us to decenter and to avoid a Eurocentric or Western-centric vision on advocacy. I gave you 2 examples that are very local. First of all, because I know them better, and secondly, because since we do an awful lot of talk on the global, paying attention to the local, wherever the local might be, it could be in South Africa, in Nigeria, in Syria, or in India, it's equally important. And this is something that we should not forget.
Question from Marina. I also think that the monitoring and evaluation itself takes up a chunk of the project budget. At one point, does an organization internalize the cost of M&E versus securing a share of a project budget every time there is an ask?
My approach would be to make the donor pay for this, the monitoring, the measuring, and the reporting. Of course, you might invest extra time to make sure that your reporting is great, looks good, and so on, and the donor doesn't have to pay for that. But it's an integral part of the project that you are somehow co-working on, them as the financial sponsor and you as the practical implementer. So I think you really have to say it's important, and it's actually part of the budget. And ask now even the communications agencies more and more are asking the clients, say, if you want to understand the results, let's put that in the budget. It's very hard for the donors or for the clients to do this, but I think you will come out much stronger if you convince them straight away that it's an exercise that we want to do and that you need to fund as well. So put it in.
Thank you. We have a question from Alessandro. What tactics can civil society organizations employ to educate, for lack of a better word, the new breed of philanthropists, such, for example, the growing number of young HNYIs, which may not be fully informed on the nuances around some of the social challenges they may be interested in funding? to ensure they understand where funds could make the most difference and not create unsustainable funding systems in the long term?
You want to take that on?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, and I am not an expert, so forgive me if I didn't get everything right. I would say one of the fundamental characteristics of a good advocate is to be able to persevere and to be extremely patient, precisely in explaining things that might not be grasped by some donors, some philanthropic foundations, especially when you are campaigning for something new or when you want to achieve something extremely difficult, such as behavioral changes. So I think that especially for civil society actors, and civil society actors today tend to be quite leaderless. And so this idea of persevering and being extremely patient is not very easy. And in a world with fatigue happens quite rapidly, these are virtues and qualities that as advocates we should cherish and cultivate.
I would add that I still believe in personal connections, and especially so if you're an individual, I think your impact would be much higher if you can arrive at the stage where you meet your potential donor, whether it's a person or an organization. And of course, you will have to do the groundwork of writing and so on. But for me, the tipping point is when you meet these people, right? And it's not sending that proposal because you are convinced, you have the fire in you, and you can really manage that. So for me, the personal, develop a network like that, go out, speak to people, waste time on this, but it's time that you will recuperate at one point.
Question from Suzanne. Do you know about tools that donor foundations build or use to measure the sustainability of the projects they fund or they consider funding?
On my side, what I've seen is it really differs. I mean, as much as I mentioned the theory of change of logic model, which seems to be taken up by a number of organizations, measurement is the weakest link in advocacy interventions like that. Because it depends also on the project, right? You measure something differently according to the project, to the country, the data that you can collect. So I haven't seen anything. If you want to check one thing around the Association of for the Measurement of and Evaluation of Communication, talks a bit about advocacy, but it's around more communications, not really about your interventions, if you will. So I haven't seen anything convincing, one block.
And also on the sustainability, this is it's not so new, but it's a relatively recent kind of concern. For so long, the issue of the sustainability of the money given out wasn't there. The results were there, but it was not framed in terms of the sustainability of it all. This is one thing. And the word itself, sustainability, is just like advocacy, is a word that needs to be defined, and you will see that the definition of it are quite heterogeneous and quite different, and the ways in which donors interpret it or give meaning to it might be quite surprisingly different.
Question from Andrea. If the NGO is small or medium, should everyone get some level of training in advocacy? Could we consider useful to have everyone aware of its importance and the basic skills of it if they do exist?
Absolutely. That would be a clear recommendation for me that everybody, all the staff go through some kind of advocacy training. Because everybody does advocacy in a sense, right? If you're a project manager in Mali working on a particular health intervention or development program, you are doing advocacy. And if you're in the management team of that NGO trying to seek funding, you are doing advocacy. So I think everybody needs that kind of training. We've done it actually with the executive education team here at the Institute. We've trained a number of NGOs and private sector companies and associations in advocacy so that everybody would understand what it is.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I also think that for small NGOs, whether they come from the south, the north, from the east or west, it doesn't make any kind of difference. But especially for small NGOs, where plenty of people are also, at least partially, volunteers, because some of them might be might get a salary, but the salary is just part of what they do. They do it because they really believe in working with that particular NGO. The very moment you also act as a volunteer, you are doing advocacy, what you do, the way you do it, the actions that you take, and who you are as an individual, the way you talk about what you're doing, the fact that you believe in what you're doing means that you are de facto an advocate. Hence, having some kind of training and some kind of awareness on sensitive questions, the way you're operating, and some kind of reflexivity on who you are and what you're bringing, where you're going, risking to offend some people and some other cultures, etc., is extremely important. So I totally join Christophe on this one.
We don't have any further questions, so we thank you very much for your very engaging questions.
Yes, excellent questions.
And thank the panelists as well. Thank you, Davide. Thank you, Christophe.
Thank you, Yvette.
And we will send you the slides afterwards. Please do not hesitate to contact us if you have any further questions about the program. We look forward to seeing you and wish you a very, very good end of day.
Goodbye. Bye.